Hey everybody, it is Nathan and Michael again today, and we're moving into the next section of our conversation about the tabernacle. And so last time we talked about putting the tabernacle in the context of the overall biblical story.
Mhm.
And so we're going to do a quick recap, and then we're going to move into the next lesson. So first, though, we wanted to define a couple terms.
Right.
And Nathan, why don't you throw me a term, and then I'll try to define it, and then you can help me define it.
Well, a term we were introduced to, last week was the concept of a holy God. So what is meant by the word holy?
Yeah. And I think it's a super churchy word. And so I think people hear it a lot and then don't really think too deeply about what it means. So it's a good thing that we're covering it. But the word holy, when you break it down to its essence, it means something that's set apart. So there's an implication of like purity and stuff like that
Or
in
distinctness or something like that?
yeah, distinctness, uniqueness, like holiness. I heard this is kind of a goofy example, so I don't know, maybe edit it out if it's too goofy. But we don't actually do editing. But in an example I heard once is that there is something that's set apart for a particular use is something that's holy. So you think about like if somebody else was going to use your toothbrush, how do you react? And I will tell you that I've had my toothbrush used, and my
Oh, no.
reaction is wrath. It's holy wrath.
There's only one reaction to have. It is
There's no
wrath.
little reaction when somebody uses your toothbrush.
Oh.
And so your toothbrush is holy. It's set apart for your particular use. Or maybe a better example would be...
No, I feel like that's perfect.
Well, let me just throw one more out in case we have any like snobs watching and they're like, why are they bringing up almost said teeth brushes. The toothbrush was invented in Arkansas. I should not have said that. Just kidding. I love Arkansas. I have good friends in Arkansas, and they have multiple teeth. Okay. So another example would be if a hospital room, like if you're going in to do surgery, like certain things are going to be required of you. You're going to have to maybe wear certain things. You're going to have to sanitize whatever you bring in there because you're doing surgery. Like everything needs to be set apart in that room, right? It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be, it's for a specific purpose. And so you have to treat it in a certain way.
Okay.
So
let me say it back to you then. I'm probably gonna say your exact same words, just so I'm clear. Holy, say the words. Holy would be distinct, its own category, set apart, but not just set apart for the purpose of just being different, but it's set apart by the nature of it being used for something super specific. So set apart for a purpose, which to be set apart for a purpose, to be distinct, often requires some form of purity or cleansing or clear boundary lines between this and that.
Clear boundary lines, good.
So to say that God is holy, we would say he is in his own unique category. There's nothing else that you can cleanly compare him to. Like kind of analogies would maybe kind of start to work on him, but they would all fall short because he's at the end of the day, he's in his own category and he has his own purposes. And then to apply that to us, if God's going to make us holy, that means he is somehow making us distinct from others around us, purifying us, not for the purpose of just being different, but for the purposes of doing something specific that he has in mind. So
and we saw that last week with the nation of Israel, how he said, I am calling you as a peculiar treasure unto myself. And the purpose was that they would be a kingdom of priests. They would be a nation that's representing him to the rest of the nation. So he separated, so the entire nation of Israel was holy. It was set apart for a particular purpose.
Got it. Okay,
and,
so that doesn't necessarily
God
mean...
he's completely other, like there are no categories because there's nobody else that's infinite, that has no beginning or end, that is the creator, it lives outside of time and space and matter. Like, he's unique. He's completely holy.
Okay. So I think we got a good mark on holiness and kind of what are some of the purposes of holiness, or like the purpose of holiness and the outward markers, and kind of like that all makes sense in that context. Another word we heard was covenant. Remind us again what that word means and how we would apply it to the story we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think the covenant that most people are the most familiar with today is like a marriage covenant. And it is two people or two parties, to use like legal language, that are that are agreeing together. They're making and it goes. Say it again.
Like a contract or something like that?
Yeah, it's like a contract. It's an agreement. It goes deeper than like a business contract, usually, because
like in the same way that marriage is deeper than a business contract.
Right. In marriage, two people are vowing to each other for life, and that's a covenant especially in biblical times, or even in a lot of, just not even the nations that were necessarily directly related to what was going on in the Bible, but the ancient Near East, covenants were huge. And so you see several examples of covenants in the Bible, like David and Jonathan make a covenant with each other. And what it meant was, I'm sticking with you for life, and I will spill my own blood for you, if I need to. And sometimes it would have a certain, there'd be, if the covenant means I'm going to do this for you, you're going to do this for me.
Right.
It's a coming together in a unity.
Okay.
So that was a very neat definition.
No. So to kind of link back to holiness, when we talked about last week, God makes a covenant with the people of Israel.
Right.
He's saying, I'm going to do certain things for you, and you're going to have to do certain things on your end of the covenant. Right. God's going to make them holy. And part of them being holy means they're going to be used for certain purposes. You hold up your end of the covenant, and I'll hold up my end of the covenant, and we'll run the show together, basically. So,
I like your Pac-Man hands as they're like eating each other in the covenant.
Right. Disturbing.
No, yeah, but that's what it is. Yeah, they're coming together in agreement, and so yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. The one last term I think we should define real quick. Tabernacle. What does that mean?
Yeah, and that's the easiest. In one way, because literally it's just a tent. It's a temporary dwelling place. And so in this context, what we're talking about, because all of the Israelites lived in tabernacles, quote unquote, in tabernacles, right? Because they left Egypt, they are moving to a new land, they are, they're nomadic. They're at this point in the story. They're not settled in anywhere. And so they have these tents, these temporary structures that they'll set up and that they live in. And so where we had gotten to is God told Moses that he wanted the children of Israel to build him a tabernacle so that he could dwell among them. So everyone else is going to have a tabernacle, and then God also is going to have a place where he's going to take up residence. Okay. So usually when we talk about the tabernacle, that's what we're referring to, is the tent in which God dwells.
Okay, and since, again, linking it back to holiness, since God is holy, that means he's his own category set apart, and the people that enter into his presence, or the people whom God is trying to make holy, are also going to be set apart and very distinct. So we should expect that tabernacle that God's dwelling in to somehow be distinct from all the other tabernacles that are in the camp of Israel. Like there should be certain outward or inward, like certain outward markers that are different from this tabernacle, from all the other tents that the Israelites are dwelling in, a different purpose for this tent that God's dwelling in versus all the other tents that the Israelites are. Right. So,
yeah, absolutely. Because of the nature of who God is, he's not a physical being. He's not a human, he's not somebody that's walking around in the same way they are. God is a spiritual being. And when he appears to them on Mount Sinai, he appears in thunder and cloud and lightning and fire and smoke. And so how do you set up a dwelling place for that kind of a being, And so it's going to have to be unique, it's going to have to be set apart.
All right. So now that we got those terms out of the way, let's carry on. Give us a quick recap of where all we covered, last time we talked, and then carry on into the rest of the rest of the series.
Okay. So what we were doing, again, like I said earlier, is we were setting it in the biblical narrative, in the storyline of the entire Bible. And so, I'm going to highlight, it's going to seem like I'm covering unnecessary details for a second, but I'm going to just highlight a couple things about what we covered last week that's going to play into what we're talking about tonight. So
take it away.
God creates the world in the beginning of the story. And in Genesis 1, you see 6 days where God's creating the world. And on the seventh day, God ends his work and he rests. And you see everything's beautiful. Everything's perfect. It's a great environment. Trees are yielding fruit and animals are coming forth, and the light is divided from the darkness and all of these things. But the sixth day, work and then the seventh day rest becomes a theme throughout the rest of the Bible. Okay. Then you see humanity sin, disrupting the relationship with God. They are no longer able to have the same kind of relationship with their creator that they did initially. And so they're separated from God's presence. And then you see this world. And if you could look at it in this way, when God first created the world, and then he rests on the seventh day, and it says he sees everything he made. Behold, it was very good. Mm-hmm. And the heavens and the earth were finished and all the hosts of them. And God rests. And it's like he settled into his creation. So at that point in the story, where is God's dwelling place? And it's all of creation in a sense, you know.
All of creation is his temple.
Yeah, it's his temple. Yeah, that's where he dwells, and that's where but then because of sin and because of separation, you see this separation happening between the people, the created and the creator. And you see them not living the way that God wants them to live. And so things get so bad that God says, I'm going to start over. And it's like, and when you read the story, it's like an uncreation. And so you read about the order in which God creates things in Genesis 1 and 2. And then he says he's going to send a flood. And like that order reverses to the point where the world is covered in water again, like it was in the beginning when the earth was without form and void and darkness was on the face of the deep and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. So there's this like backwards, but this time God's already created people and he saves one family, and he asks this family, and the man's name is Noah, and interestingly, Noah's name means rest. So it's another form. There's the word rest that means Sabbath, and then there's another form that's like Noach in Hebrew, and it's where we get Noah's name. So it means rest, and so he tells this man whose name means rest that he's going to start over with him. He's going to make a new creation, in essence.
Is he like a new Adam? Is he like a new Adam?
He's like a new Adam, yeah. In fact, the first Adam said because of what him and Eve did, there was a curse brought on the ground. And Noah's father, the reason he names him Noah is because he says, maybe this boy that is born is going to give us rest from the ground that the Lord has cursed. So they were looking forward to something. They're looking forward to things returning to the way they were before sin entered and ruined things.
Okay.
And so that's the hope. And so and it's interesting the way that God, he does this. He has them build an ark, and he gives Noah a very specific pattern. And I guess I should say the title, I guess, of the lesson that we're going to talk about tonight is the pattern of the tabernacle. That's the concept I'm going to be focusing in on. And so in this review, I'm already dialing into that.
So are you going to be implying here in a second that something about the pattern of what happens with Adam or later on with Noah, something about those patterns is something that's going to help us learn about the pattern that's within this tent that God makes to dwell amongst Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, because we start to get some principles here.
Okay. So how we interpret the tabernacle whenever we encounter it amongst the Israelites should be informed by what we've already learned in Adam and Noah.
Yeah, because the scriptures build on themselves, and and as you read through the story, you start to get different principles. And I think sometimes the reason I'm spending so much time studying the tabernacle in its biblical context is because when we come in without reference to the other things, the other concepts that are already being built, then we can get lost really easily.
I got it. Okay, so you're saving us from dropping right into the middle of Leviticus or Numbers or Exodus and being like, what on earth is this gobbledygook? Like, I cannot make sense of it at all. Okay.
I'm trying to avoid people using the term gobbledygook in reference to the Bible. That's like, if I can accomplish that, I will have accomplished my goal.
Okay. So essentially what you're telling us is the longest way around is the shortest way home to actually understand this.
Yes. Yeah. That is my strategy.
Okay. No, keep going.
We're taking the scenic route so that you appreciate when we get there.
So the pattern of Noah, keep unpacking this.
Okay. So here's the deal. The world is going to be destroyed in a flood. Like that's the first thing he tells him. He's like, Noah, I regret making man, and I'm going to destroy the world in a flood. And so that's pretty bad news. He's like, all the living creatures are going to be destroyed, and it's going to be pretty awful. So, but I am going to provide a way of escape for you and your family. And we know that the way of escape was an ark. But he doesn't just say, hey, figure out, like, go to the local market and buy Ark Building for Dummies and just figure out how to do this. He actually gives him like plans. He tells him what kind of wood to use. He tells him to pitch it within and without. He gives him dimensions even, like it needs to be this long by this wide by this tall. It needs to have 3 stories. There needs to be a window. Like he tells him all these things about, this is how I want you to build this thing. And so God gives him the plans. And because Noah follows those plans, that is the vehicle that it saves his family from this flood and enables the world to start again. You know, he becomes the new Adam in this new creation, like you said earlier. And so, and I want to focus on that for just a second, because there are some misconceptions, I think, in modern day Christianity that it's important to address. And so the Bible says Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And I think a lot of times when I talk to people about grace, there's this sense that it's just kind of a free pass. Like if Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, then that means God's just going to remove him from the situation and everything's cool. But in addition to Noah finding this grace, and so to define grace, that means like, it means favor. It means my pastor will say grace is when you get what you don't deserve. Like it's God's empowering favor, I guess, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So we'll just leave that there, I guess.
That makes sense to me. I've always heard it described as mercy is not getting what you do deserve, and grace is getting what you don't deserve, with the biblical concept of grace being a little more fleshed out. It's God giving you something you don't deserve, but that something he gives you is also something that simultaneously is empowering you. It's not just like a neutral blank thing. Good. It's not just good things that happen to you, although it includes good things. It's specifically good things you don't deserve that somehow also empower you to do something. Yeah.
And so put that into the story of Noah, and he is given a means of salvation.
So for Noah to find grace doesn't mean that Noah is given a free pass because Noah is pretty and God likes him. Noah is given favor of the Lord in an empowering way. So God gives Noah a means of escape, but in specific instructions, like very detailed instructions of how to save himself, and then empowers him to carry out what he's called him to do. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, okay. Exactly. Because he gives him the plans, but then he still expects, so there's this, would Noah have been saved if God hadn't, if he hadn't found grace in God's eyes? Well, of course not, because he would never have gotten the plans, but God still expected him to cut down the trees for the gopher wood and to get the materials that he needed. And so there was still something that Noah was doing. And yet, of course, I do believe that was divinely empowered by God in order to do it. So he receives this plan. And what's interesting is when it's time to get into the ark, God says, in 7 days, I will cause it to start raining on the earth. And so you see, again, you're seeing this pattern emerge from Genesis 1. God, there's something new beginning in 7 days, right? So he's like, in 7 days, I'm going to cause it to rain on the earth. So I want you and your family to come into the ark with all the animals. And then it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. That's how long it takes for, and it says the fountains of the deep break up and the windows of heaven are open, but it specifically mentions 40 days and 40 nights for this, everything's being washed out, right? Everything's being destroyed, and it's in this process of 40 days and 40 nights. And then they're still in the ark for a long time after that, but when they come out, they're emerging into a new creation. And then, like we talked about last week, still rebellion emerges in Noah's family. Even in Noah, himself, he makes some mistakes there, and his sons make mistakes, and then their descendants rebel against God, and then God chooses a family out of these descendants, and it's the family of Abraham that he makes a covenant with, which we talked about. And that family, by the time of our story, is coming out of bondage, out of slavery in Egypt. They come to Mount Sinai, and God makes a covenant with, he already made a covenant with Abraham, and now he's making a covenant with the whole nation. And he says he's going to bring them into a new land. They're going to be a kingdom of priests, and all the people agree with this covenant. We saw this ceremony happening last time, like a marriage ceremony, and they even went up onto the mountain, and there was these separate zones where people were allowed. So on the mountain, you see fire and smoke and God's presence, and everyone's freaked out. And so the people are placed outside of these boundaries at the base of the mountain. Then God speaks to Moses and tells him to bring 70 elders, Aaron and his sons, and they are supposed to come up a little further into the mountain where they, according to the scripture, see the God of Israel, and they eat and drink there before him. And then Moses is called to come up even closer. Okay. And so that's where we kind of left off last week. Did you want to add anything to?
No, that sounds great. Keep trucking.
Okay. So, and I wanted to show one more thing in Exodus 24 that'll relate to what we were just talking about with these patterns. And it's in Exodus 24:12. So, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so people can see the scriptures here. And let's see. I'll make it bigger. Okay, so in Exodus 24:12, the Lord tells Moses, "Come up to me into the mount and be there," which is a cool phrase also, just be there. "And I'll give you tables of stone, a law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them." So Moses and his servant Joshua get up, they go into the mount of God, and he tells the elders, just wait here for us, we're going to come back, and Aaron and Hur are in charge. So if anybody needs anything, go to Aaron and Hur. And if you know your Bible stories, you know how that works out. But we're not getting there yet. So at this point, they just made this covenant with God. Moses is going up to get a little more instructions to teach the people. And it says that Moses goes up into the mountain and the cloud is covering it. And the glory of the Lord stays on Mount Sinai. And the cloud covers it. How long? 6 days. 6 days. Have you ever seen that before? And the seventh day, he calls to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Okay. So some people may think I'm focusing too much on like numbers here and like, that's just a coincidence. But I really don't think there are coincidences like that in the Bible. I think it's designed that way. And I think what we're seeing here is just like 6 days creation, the seventh day rest, something new begins, God settling in. Here he's called up onto the mountain. And I picture Moses, because it doesn't say God talked to him until the seventh day, right? So he's like walking up there and he's, I don't know, finding this place to camp or whatever. And he's like, where is, what am I supposed to be doing here? God, are you going to give me these tables of stone and commandments? But then on the seventh day, he calls to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. So this is something new is beginning. God is coming, in a sense, to settle into a new creation. Okay. Are you with me?
I am. So,
you look skeptical.
I think I'm connecting the dots. So you're telling me at Genesis, like basically when we get here to this story, we shouldn't be surprised because we've already read this, a kind of a parallel of this happen a couple times. You're telling me in Genesis chapter 1, God in 7 days creates the world, the holy God creates the world, sets it apart for his purposes, sets man apart for his purposes, maybe makes man holy. I don't know if you would say that, but
yeah, absolutely.
Calls man, makes him distinct, sets him apart for his purposes on the seventh day. Then when man sins in 7 days, he sets Noah apart for his purposes. Tells Noah, you're going to do something distinct, very distinct instructions. I'm setting you apart from what's going to happen to everybody else. And he uncreates the world at the end of the 7 days. And then you're telling me later on, we get to Moses. The pattern of, when we see the pattern of 7, we should think, okay, God is getting ready to set somebody apart as distinct and holy for some sort of special purpose. And that special purpose is probably going to have something to do with creating something new. Yeah,
right, exactly. So, something new is beginning. There's something going on here, right? When you see the 6 days and then the seventh day, it should be like, okay, God is doing something big here.
Okay, I think I've got the dots connected. Keep going.
Okay, and so the parallels don't end there. So the way this looks to the people on the ground is the sight of the glory of the Lord is like devouring fire on top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. So this is intense that Moses is up here, right, in this devouring fire on top of the mountain. Moses goes into the cloud, up into the mountain, and how long is he there? He's there for 40 days. And 40 nights.
Just like Noah. Okay. So just like Noah, while the world's being uncreated.
Yeah.
While the holy God sets Noah apart while he uncreates the world, he sets Moses apart while he gets ready to do something new. Something with creation.
So all of this language is leading us to see like, okay, whatever's going to happen next is significant, right?
Okay.
Whatever he says next, this is a big deal because the last time we saw this, he's creating the world and then he's like uncreating the world and creating a new world in essence, and now he's creating this new nation and we're seeing the same pattern emerge.
Okay.
Okay. So as we go on here, The first thing, so what is God going to tell Moses? He told him, come up, I'm going to give you the tables of stone, commandments to teach. And we already saw him lay out some like societal rules, like, all right, this is how I want you to handle it if there's a murder or somebody steals and blah, blah. You know, like he went through some different things. He already gave them the 10 commandments. So we may be expecting some more like moral or civil laws like that.
Okay, so now we're in Exodus 25.
So now we're in Exodus 25. And this is what God says when Moses comes up onto the mountain during this significant time. He speaks to Moses and says, I want you to tell the children of Israel to bring me an offering of every man who gives it willingly with his heart, take my offering. And then he lists a bunch of materials. Okay. So again, similar to how he told Noah what kind of materials he was going to need to build the ark. But these are even more specific and maybe, when you're reading it for the first time, they seem completely random. He's like, so gold and silver and brass, blue, purple, scarlet, fine linen, goat's hair, badger skins in the King James. Others say like, porpoise skins or something like that, like this some sort of wood or acacia wood,
So some sort of animal skin, some sort of wood, just a long list of materials.
Oil, spices, incense, these certain stones. And so I want you to gather all these things from the children of Israel, he's saying. I want you to gather up all this material. And then verse 8, and this is like the key to the whole tabernacle study. This verse is like, if I was going to set a verse over the whole study, this is the one it would be. Exodus 25:8, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. And according to all that I show thee after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it. So he tells him, I want you. So something new is beginning, something unique, something different. And this different thing is he wants them to make him a sanctuary. And similar with Noah, he had to actually do some work. Like the children of Israel are actually going to have to provide some materials for this. But the purpose, and do you notice like the language, even how it's used is a privilege. Like allow them to make me a sanctuary. Let them make me a sanctuary. And what is the purpose? So that I may dwell among them. God wants to dwell in their midst. He wants to be with them. And I don't know, do we need to define sanctuary? That might be helpful, huh?
Sure, go for it.
So the word sanctuary is, and it's what we were talking about before. Basically, it's a holy place. It's a consecrated thing or place, an asylum. And so we still like, especially in like, I don't know, Middle Ages time, Renaissance times, that people would appeal for sanctuary. They'd run into a church or something and appeal for sanctuary. But he's saying, let them make me a set apart place so that I can dwell among them. Okay. And then he tells them, I'm going to show you how to do this, and I'm going to give you a pattern of a tent, a pattern of all the things that you're going to use in the tent, and you're going to make it according to this pattern. Okay. He doesn't, and this concept comes up several other times as you go through the scriptures. He says, when you get down to the end of chapter 25, verse 40, he's already told him how to make a couple things. And he says, look that thou make them after the pattern, which was showed thee in the mount. Like, make sure you make it according to what you're going to see here. So God, in this 40 days and 40 nights, what he's doing is he's showing Moses a tabernacle. He's showing him something, and he wants him to make it according to that pattern. All right. Okay. So, any questions before?
Yeah, can you scroll back up to Exodus 25, I think 10?
Yes.
The parallels are going further. There's one of the things that's supposed to happen in this tabernacle is going to be something called an ark. But didn't we just learn about something called an ark with Noah? What's this ark thing that we're supposed to make inside the tabernacle? Does that relate at all to, is this another pattern or no?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's another. Yeah, that's awesome. And it's I think it's actually a different word, but in both cases it's talking about like a rectangular box-like structure. But I do think it's meant to bring our minds back to it. And and it's funny because Noah and his family are saved in an ark. It's a place of safety. It's a place where God's presence is going to carry them through the flood. Later on, when Moses was born, actually, the Pharaoh wanted to kill all the baby Hebrews, the male children, and Moses was a Hebrew male child, and the way his mother saved him, if you'll remember, and the way they wanted to kill them is by throwing them all in the river. He wanted to drown them, right?
Sure.
And his mother saves him by putting him in an ark of in a basket in a little chest, and that's how Moses himself was saved. And so now I'm gonna spend a lot of time a little later on in one of the other lessons on the ark, but now he's telling it, and it is funny when you've like been looking at all this and you've been studying it and you see this and you get real excited. But if you're just looking at it for the first time, it seems really random. He's like, I want you to make it, because basically the word ark means chest. It's like a
treasure chest or a box. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's like, and I want you to make a box. And then he goes into all these details. But I will tell you that the ark, this is the Ark of the Covenant, which people may be familiar from Indiana Jones, or they may have, heard preaching about it or whatever. But this was going to be the center of where God's glory is going to dwell. He's going to dwell over this chest. It's going to be like God's throne or footstool in this tent, in this tabernacle. So again, the purpose is so that God can dwell amongst them. And we'll get a lot more into that as we go on.
But the point is, your point's well taken. We're seeing a lot of parallels.
Yeah.
Moses being saved in an ark, being set apart, being made distinct in an ark.
Yes.
God makes this distinct, set apart tent called a tabernacle. And he says, I want this tabernacle to be a sanctuary, like a safe haven, a place where I dwell with them. And in this place, I want to build an ark. So you should be getting, when you see this, you should be getting hints of, okay, God's making something new. And this is going to be a place where his presence dwells. It's going to be set apart for some sort of distinct purpose. It's going to involve intimacy with God, and it's going to involve some sort of saving element. Being saved from something is going to be part of what's going on in this symbology. Like that's what we should be able to comfortably pull, going just as shallow as we've gone into the story, just from what we've learned in the other parallel passages. Is we should be expecting distinctness, holiness, set apart, safety, being saved from something, and intimacy with God and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Okay.
So and I get super excited when I start seeing things like this, because you see God's plan unfolding. You see how he even prepares us, even just subconsciously sometimes through the other stories, for what's going to happen. Because again, this is one of those chapters, because he's listing all these materials and he starts listing how to make this stuff. And it's one of those chapters where people get lost. I think, the first time I read it, I'm like, what in the world is even happening right now?
Okay. But the reason why all these details are important is like all the details that Adam had to go through, where he's naming every animal, all the rigmarole that he's going through, all the rigmarole and the most sanctimonious or the most sanctified.
Yeah, that's Hebrew for a lot of stuff.
Yeah, all the rigmarole that Noah's going through to get the ark ready. It's causing them. It's not like they're having to work to earn God's favor. God's already chosen them and called them and made them distinct. But in response to God calling them, he's asking them to take it with a level of seriousness that costs something from not that, again, he calls them and makes them holy and distinct before they've done anything. Like they didn't work to impress God, and then God says, cool, we'll strike a deal. He calls them, but then says to actually approach me to be saved, you're gonna have to take this really seriously and pay really close attention to a lot of details I'm gonna give you. It matters that you get the details of obedience to me right and do it my way, not your way. So all the details he gives to Noah are for the purpose of conditioning Noah's mind to approach God on God's terms, not on Noah's terms. Same way, Moses gets the plans for the tabernacle, and it's all these details conditioning Moses not to think that he's going to work to be worthy of God's presence. God's already bringing his presence there. But to say that now my presence is here and I'm making you holy, it has to change you, and you have to approach me on your own, not on your own terms, but on my terms, which means paying attention to every detail that I give you, no matter what the details are.
Yes, exactly. And that's the main application point I want to highlight out, the initial application point, I guess, that I want to highlight out of this. When God gives you something detailed to do, don't just throw out, don't throw out the details. Don't say, well, I don't know about that, God. Because essentially that's what Adam and Eve were doing in the Garden of Eden. They traded God's knowledge of good and evil, what God says is good and evil, for their own version of it, right? Well, actually, we're going to decide what is good and evil. We're going to decide what's right and wrong for our lives. And so because I do think that's one of the main things when you first read through this, even if you don't understand what any of it is, you notice, wow, this is really specific. Like I believe it's the next 6 or 7 chapters, interestingly, that start describing this, how he's going to build the tabernacle. And it's full of all these super specific details. And so you realize, okay, well, this must be important. If God takes 2 chapters to describe creation, and then he takes, 6 or 7 chapters. I don't actually remember how many. That's why I'm saying that. But he takes from chapters 25 through 31, do some quick math, that many chapters to describe how to build the tabernacle. And then he takes another chapters 35 through 40 to describe them building the tabernacle. So
we should be really before I'll let you keep going to explain the pattern of the tabernacle, but we should be if we're paying attention to the patterns, God gives some amount of details when he makes creation new. He gives more details when he's undoing creation. And now he's giving a lot of details.
Yeah.
And it should be pointing us to, okay, the gravity of what he's about to make must be way, way, way more important than matter and material itself. Something really deep, something really huge is getting ready to be made.
Right.
In God's creation. Okay.
Right. Because if God didn't want us to know this stuff, if this was really just for the builders of the tabernacle, well, okay, just put it in, give them the instructions separately, and then let, put the important stuff in the book that everyone is supposed to read and people are supposed to memorize and stuff. The Jews would memorize the first 5 books of the Torah which is the first 5 books of the Bible before they were, I said the first 5 books of the Torah, but that is what the Torah is, the first 5 books. Anyways. If only we edited. Yeah. So now I forgot what I was saying. It's important. And he put it in here for a reason. Oh, yeah. So what I want to do now is take us to a New Testament scripture to show us, this is going to be my case for okay, Michael, you've pointed out some cool things or whatever. Maybe. That's what I'm hoping people are saying in their homes right now. I see where you're going, but why do we need to know these specific details? Why don't we just skip to the New Testament?
Why isn't it good enough to know, okay, it was really specific. We're glad it was specific. The end. Yeah. We don't need to know the details.
Right. So we're going to turn now to Hebrews chapter 8. And the book of Hebrews is the quintessential book in the New Testament that describes how we should understand what's happening in the new covenant in light of what happened in the old covenant. And so I guess I better define that.
The old covenant is what we're talking about here, the covenant God makes with Israel at Sinai. Right. And the new covenant you're talking about is, I'm assuming, the same thing as the New Testament.
Yes,
where the word testament, covenant are used kind of interchangeably potentially. Mm-hmm. Where Jesus, no kind of foreshadowing, the covenant God makes with Adam doesn't turn out because Adam and Eve don't fulfill their end of the bargain. The covenant he makes with Noah doesn't work out because Noah, even though he starts off right, following the details, him and his family end up making mistakes. They don't live up to it either. Abraham's family, the Israelites, they start off good. Plot twist. All this that we're going to find out, they don't live up to their end of the covenant either.
Right.
And so we're going to eventually get to the New Testament, which is the latest covenant that God in the form of Jesus makes with the rest of us. So the old covenant, but we're not to that part of the story. The old covenant is this trial that God's trying with the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. And in the New Testament, or the new covenant, this is hundreds of years in the future from Mount Sinai. The writer of Hebrews is looking back at this old covenant that we're learning about now and saying, here's how you should read it and understand it in light of what comes next.
Yeah, exactly. Because the new covenant, it's not new in the sense that he's just throwing everything that he already did out. He's like, okay, well, that was a disaster, so we're just starting over from scratch.
He's not hitting the reset button.
What?
You're saying he's not hitting the reset button.
He's not in the sense of disregarding everything that already happened, because the old covenant actually prepares the way, and it builds, everything in the new covenant is built out of what happened in the old covenant. So it's the problem with the old covenant was that people are fleshly, and what did you say last week? We have a we have a bug in our operating system or something.
Sure.
Like that?
So you're saying the old covenant, which is all this insane detail that God's telling Moses about how to build the tabernacle and all the moral laws and all the eat this but don't eat this, except for on Sundays, then you do this, and then on Mondays you blink twice, and then all the insane details, all of that is not something we should just look at and be like, oh, a lot of details, they were supposed to take it seriously, I get it now, great, the end, forget about it. You're saying no, the way that changes people, having to try to follow all these laws actually matters, because how it changes people lays the foundation for the next covenant that God builds on top of this one. So
right. Well, Jesus said when he came, he said to the people, I don't want you to think that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not coming to destroy them. I'm coming to fulfill them, to fill them up, like to give them meaning, to show what it really is. Like he was coming to, and he even says in there, he says, if you, actually, I'm not going to try to quote it because I can't remember exactly, but the point I'm making is like there was a purpose. It wasn't like the Old Testament was like draft one and it was a flop, so just rip it up. It was the Old Testament was laying the groundwork for the New Testament, like, so Jesus comes and he is everything that was established in the Old Testament was necessary, but he's coming and fulfilling it so that we can partake of the new covenant, so that we can be the way that he wants. Okay,
so what you're going to do then, if I'm understanding correctly, you're going to read a passage of scripture in the book of Hebrews that's written in context of that new covenant that's built on top of the old one we were just talking about at Mount Sinai and Moses and God and all that stuff. So you're gonna give us this passage from Hebrews, which is gonna kind of show us how we should be interpreting the old covenant, and then you're gonna go back to the old covenant and finish laying out the pattern of the tabernacle.
Yeah, well, I won't give the details of the pattern because that's over the next several lessons. We're gonna look at each piece individually and see how it applies. But so this is really just laying the groundwork for why it needs to be so specific and why it applies to us. Like,
so you're telling me,
what can we get out of it? That's what I want to.
You're telling me the precursor to the Old Testament. To understand the Old Testament, we actually have to go to the New Testament as the foundation to understand the Old Testament. That's what I'm saying.
That's how crazy the Bible is. It's all interlocked. But that's why we're here to help you. So
that's good. That's awesome. Okay, so lead onwards.
Okay,
show me.
So Hebrews 8, he says he's been already writing for 7 chapters. So you're going to have to pause this, go read the first 7 chapters, then come back. But what but what he does, he sums it up for us, which is great. And he says, here's the sum of what we've just been talking about. We have a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. He's talking about Jesus here, fulfilling the function of the priest, which we'll talk more about. And then he says something interesting about Jesus. He is a minister of the sanctuary. And we saw that word come up in Exodus 25:8. Let them make me a sanctuary. So Jesus is a minister of the consecrated holy place. All right. Which is odd because at this point in history, God wasn't dwelling in a tent, right? They had actually replaced the tent with a permanent building called the temple. And Jesus wasn't even one of the qualified priests that would go in and out and actually do stuff there. And yet the author of Hebrews is telling us, but he is a minister of the sanctuary, but it's not what you're expecting. It's the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man.
Okay.
So there's something interesting happening here. We see that man in Exodus was pitching a tabernacle. They're setting up a tent for the Lord to dwell in, and God gives them the pattern. But he's saying that tent is actually just I should keep reading, but he says there is a tent. There's a true tent. So he's saying that tent that they set up in Exodus, it wasn't apparently the true tabernacle. All right. So and now you're like, okay, you just threw me for a loop. Oops, I just hit my microphone.
So you're telling me, I think I do understand what you're saying. You're saying something that God wants Moses and the Israelites to build and enact physically in the world. This actual tent made out of actual like animal skins and has
something
all this
physical.
all these insane details. That's supposed to do like somehow
it's representing something else. It's representing something true.
The act of okay. So it's kind of like something physical is supposed to be representing something abstract and spiritual. That doesn't mean it's any less real, but by walking through a physical representation of the spiritual thing, that actually allows you to interact with the spiritual thing by building or interacting with an imperfect physical representation of it. So you can't mistake the physical version for the real spiritual version that you're interacting with. But you should be taking this physical version that you're seeing seriously, because he's
so gracious because he gives us a physical version that can teach us things about the true reality, right?
Okay.
And so that's why it's cool that that it even existed and that we have the plans for it.
Okay, so in some ways, could you say that the tent, the tabernacle in the Old Testament that God gives all this detail to Moses about, in some ways are those like training wheels or something like that? To get you, like, here's how you approach God, and I'll walk you through a physical environment of how you do it. And when you walk through this physical environment, that puts your mind and your spirit where it needs to be to actually interact with a holy God.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, to use a cultural, like old pop culture reference, like in the Karate Kid, where the guy is teaching the kid karate and he's saying, I want you to wax my car. And the kid's like, what does this have to do with anything? But all the things he's doing, it's teaching him the motions that he's going to need later to actually do karate. And I feel like reading through the Old Testament does that for us spiritually as well. And them living through the Old Testament, that was what it was designed for. It's putting the things in place that we're going to need to know.
Okay. Keep going.
So he goes on to say, every priest is ordained, they're set apart, they're called to offer gifts and sacrifices, which we're going to talk about. This is what would happen in the tabernacle. And he says, so this man has to have something to offer as well. The problem is, if he was on earth, and he's talking about Jesus again. He says, if he's on earth, he wouldn't be a priest, since there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. Because even though the whole nation of Israel was called to be a kingdom of priests, there was one tribe out of the 12 tribes that was separated out, that was made holy to be the ones who actually dealt with this physical earth tent tabernacle.
Okay.
And Jesus wasn't from that tribe. That was the tribe of Levi. He was from a different tribe. And so if we're just looking in the natural, Jesus wasn't even qualified to be a priest in the physical tabernacle, but the author of Hebrews is telling us that he's actually part of something much deeper, and it's the true tabernacle, the spiritual tabernacle. And then he goes on in verse 5 to say, these priests on earth, they serve the example and the shadow of heavenly things. Okay. So just like you already pointed out, there's a reality in heaven, and the tent and the tabernacle was an example of this spiritual reality. It's a shadow. So when you see a shadow, it's not the person themselves, but it's showing the outline. It's showing, if you see a shadow, like you see somebody coming around the corner, you see their shadow first, you're going to be able to tell certain things about them from the shadow. And he's saying this tent, it's just a shadow of something that was coming, of something, or of something that already exists, something real. And his basis for this, he's going to use a scriptural basis, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. That's the verse that we read in Exodus 25:40 at the end of that chapter. So he's saying, the reason I'm saying that there's an actual thing that the physical tent was representing is because Moses was told he apparently saw something, and then he was supposed to make this physical tent after the pattern of whatever he saw up there in the mountain when he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights.
Okay.
Are you with me? Okay.
I'm with you.
Okay. So we're going to come in for a landing here for this lesson. But I want to draw out the application, just the application, just a little bit more. And so we're going to talk about, if this is true, that there is a spiritual reality, then the tabernacle wasn't just some random thing that Moses invented, or that God was just like, you know what, let's throw a candlestick in there. Apparently there are spiritual realities that all of these weird things that we look at and we see, okay, so they come in and they have to offer up animals and sprinkle their blood all over the place. That's weird. What is going on? Apparently there's a spiritual reality that's representing. And then they wash in water, and then they come into this tent, and there's some bread, and there's a candlestick with light, and and then you get into the place where the Ark of the Covenant is. Apparently all those things are representing some spiritual pattern, something that is true about approaching the God in the heavenly realm. Okay. So this is already in place, right? God's word is settled in heaven forever. and he dwells in this spiritual realm. And humanity, because of our sin, is unable to approach into that spiritual realm. So he says, you know what? I'm making this nation. I want people to be able to approach me. I want to be able to dwell amongst them. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have Moses and the children of Israel make me this tent. And this is going to lay out the groundwork for how people approach me. And so as we go through, it's going to work on a couple of different levels. All right.
I'm listening.
Okay. And so, sorry. So level one.
Michael saw me frowning. That's because I'm thinking, and he thought I was displeased, or I was going to throw a hand
He's
grenade.
Like, levels? What? That's not what he was doing. He was just taking it in. Just like the ark had 3 stories. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so there's going to be there's 3 levels that I look at the tabernacle in, and I'm going to try to make it really plain as we go through, but just to let people know where I'm going with this. Level 1, Jesus, when he comes to earth, the Bible says that in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And it's referencing Jesus. It's saying the Word of God came in a physical form, right? Mm-hmm. And it dwelt among us. And the word that he uses for dwelt is the word tabernacle. So he came and tabernacled amongst us. And so there's this idea that Jesus' body, Jesus coming on earth, this human that comes and dies on the cross and rises from the dead, that in some way he is actually a representative of this true tabernacle. And again, if you go back to the definition of tabernacle, it's a temporary dwelling place where God dwells, for the tabernacle. And so Jesus comes as the tabernacle. Is that too deep? Is that too?
It's very complex. It's very dense. And I have a feeling that if you don't already have a lot of background in this, even with the background we gave, it's going to be very easy to get lost in what a lot of this means. So let me try to do my best to parrot back to you what you said and tell me if I've got it, if I understand it correctly. You're telling me God exists he's a spirit. God's a spirit, and he exists in this spiritual kind of realm. At the beginning, this spiritual realm and the earthly realm overlapped, or they were interacting, and God was interacting with man. Like, there isn't like heaven where God's at and earth where man's at. Like, heaven and earth are overlapping. Heaven is God's space and earth is human space, but it's all together. Like earth is on heaven, heaven is on earth. It's God's together with everybody. Mm-hmm. Mankind does something to sever that complete overlapping of heaven and earth.
Right.
That God dwelling, heaven just meaning the place where God dwells, the spiritual realm where God dwells. Mankind does something to sever that like tethering of God's dwelling place and humans' dwelling place. And so God can either choose to eliminate these people or allow the severing to happen and just write them off. And he chooses to do neither. He says, they're going to have to be distant from me, but I'm going to bring them back. To get them back to where the space where I dwell, the spiritual place where I dwell, and the earthly place where they dwell, is to get those to overlap again. I'm going to have to get them holy again. Like I'm going to have to change whatever went wrong with them that caused them to
right.
Break
to be
away
unfit for the heavenly realm. Now he has to somehow make us fit for the heavenly realm.
Okay, so that means, so in some ways, making us holy is him trying to restore us, not just. So I'm going to make them holy. This family, the Israelite family, holy, set apart for a distinct purpose, but they still can't grasp me. Like, I'm a spirit, and they're not completely restored yet. To get them to restore, like, I have to find a way to get them to interact with the spiritual realm, even though they're not spiritual beings. Like, they don't interact. So as you're telling me some sort of interface between the spiritual realm where God's at and the physical realm where he wants to bring humans from, or he wants to merge the two realms. He creates an interface, a physical thing on humankind's level, that if they walk through these physical things and interact with these physical objects, the physical objects themselves aren't spiritual things like where God is actually at, but they're representations of spiritual ways to interact with God. And if mankind can get it right, how to interact with these physical interfaces, they're in some ways mirroring spiritual things that exist for how to interact with God. And the better and better you get at interacting with these physical things that God has set up as kind of training wheels or an interface, the better you get at interacting with these physical things God has provided to you with all of your detail, the better you're going to get at realizing that the physical things are shallow. Like there's something deeper than the physical things. Like you'll get some sort of hint as I'm doing these physical things that I'm interacting with. There's something deeper that's going on in my mind and in my spirit that I'm realizing. I'm realizing that reality is deeper than what I'm seeing. As I touch this tabernacle, I'm physically touching something, but I can sense in my spirit that I'm also interacting with something in the spiritual realm. And the better I get at following God's instruction with this physical stuff that he's laying out, the better I'll get at understanding the spiritual ways to interact with God until eventually it's all going to be merged again. But you're telling me the tabernacle, the tent that God sets up, that ultimately we're going to go through all the stages of how God wanted people to walk through that physical interface to kind of get back to understanding how to spiritually relate to God. But eventually you'll tell us, even though there's a lot to be gained from understanding that physical interface, it ultimately falls short, and not falls short, but God builds on top of it and sends another tabernacle, another physical thing that we can interact with that's supposed to be a pattern for us, but it's even better than a house. It's a person. It's a physical person, Jesus, that we're supposed to, by interacting with him, he's a physical representation of how we can interact with God spiritually. That's what you're telling me?
And maybe to simplify it, we'll make the Jesus being the tabernacle, we'll make that level 3. But like the base level is, in order to have interaction with God, the way that God provided that in the Old Testament was through the tabernacle. Like if you want to approach the God, if you want to have some kind of interaction with him,
a spiritual
this
God,
is the way you're going to do it.
There's a physical thing you got to do to approach a spiritual God.
Here's the pattern, and the pattern is really specific. So the new level 1 is for us knowing that it's a pattern of something heavenly. The things in the tabernacle represent it still represents a truth. Like there's a reason for all these things that they had to do. And so that based on this pattern, and there's a pattern for us laid out in scripture in the New Testament of how we approach to God now. And we're going to be like, even and people might call it, the plan of salvation. To use like a churchy phrase, it's the way that we're able to have fellowship with God, that we're able to be reconciled to God. Because once you get into the deepest part of the tabernacle, that's where God's presence is. So in order to get to God's presence, right, we still today, believe it or not, have to go through these steps of the tabernacle, but we go through it in a different way than they did. We don't go to an actual physical tent. There's something else that we're doing, but the principles remain the same.
Okay. Oh, I think that's a great place to, I think I've learned enough to know that the story doesn't seem to be done, because it sounds like if God has ultimate way, there wouldn't be like physical interfaces that are representative of a second reality, a spiritual interface. Like it would be back to how God originally had it, where the physical and the physical realm where we dwell and the spiritual realm where God dwells are all overlapping. Like heaven space, God space, and human space are all together. So it sounds like the story, even though Jesus is building on the tabernacle, it sounds like the story still isn't done. Like there's still more to come.
Yeah.
And we're kind of getting dropped in the middle of this.
We're still living in this. And just to finish fleshing out the application for us, it wouldn't have made sense when God says, Noah, this is how you're going to be saved. This is how you're going to come into this new creation. For Noah to be like, you know what, gopher wood seems like a poor choice. I'm going to use a different kind of wood. Or, maybe I'll pitch it inside, but not outside, or vice versa, right? If he decided he was going to change any of the elements of God's pattern, that would be a foolish move, because there's a reason God gave him the pattern. Same with Moses in the tabernacle. God gives him a specific pattern, so it's important that he follows all the details. And it's the same with us. If God has given us a pattern for how to approach to him in our day and age, in where we're living right now, then it'd be foolish to throw out any aspect of that pattern, right? There's people that have this idea of like, well, I think God will just accept me in this way or whatever. And maybe I can come up with my own way of approaching to him. And it's like a mountain. There's many roads that lead to God, and I just choose one and go. And really, biblically, that's a foolish position to take when you're looking at the way that he's laid out patterns for salvation. If there's a pattern for our salvation, then we should follow every aspect of it. We need to reverence it. This is something holy, and so let's follow the pattern.
I like it. It's a great application. I appreciate you walking me through it. Very complex, very dense, but I think it matters a lot, and I think I understand a lot better now. If I'm going to drop into the middle of the Old Testament and see all this crazy detail, I think this context of it being a pattern for a spiritual thing, and the patterns mattering, like following God's specific instructions matter, because we're ultimately trying to approach a holy God so that we can be set apart, we can be made holy, we can be saved. It really matters. So I think this is a great place to end. It was very dense, but I appreciate you breaking it down for me so I can understand it. I think I get exactly what you're saying now.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to write them in the comments, or I don't know, I'll provide an email at some point somehow, and people can ask questions. But next time we'll get a little more specific. We'll start talking about the door that led into the tabernacle. You may not think there's much there, but I beg to differ. If I could make a whole lesson out of the word pattern, then I can make a whole lesson out of a door. So we're gonna go a little deeper, and it'll be fun. There's a lot of cool things.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan.